Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is day 2 of our Architect series for the Bay Area Salesforce Developer Group. Our wonderful co-leader Cynthia, she's lined up some great guests for us this week. We had Stephen Herod last night. Tonight we have Melissa Shepard. So Melissa Shepard is CEO and president of Lizard Tech Consulting. And she's got a presentation for us tonight. Last night we had Stephen doing an informal Q&A. He had no slides. Tonight we'll have some cool slides to look at. So some nice variety. So if everybody can stay on mute, if you have any questions directly to Melissa, post them in the Zoom chat, and Jody's going to be monitoring that and asking the questions. And then any side conversation that you have with each other, please have in Slack rather than in Zoom. So with that, I'm going to go on mute and turn the mic over to Melissa.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Shepard. Like you said, I'm president and CEO of Lizard Tech Consulting. That's my own company based out of Boston, Massachusetts, but we're mostly virtual. I have been doing Salesforce for 15 years now. I actually started doing architecture right off the bat. My background is software development. I started in Java and then moved over to .NET. And because of my .NET skills, I was brought into a company to write a customer portal and a partner portal, which are familiar to all of you probably, as now they're communities. So we were writing these 15 years ago to integrate with Salesforce. And also I built integration middleware to integrate Salesforce with our ERP system and our marketing and all kinds of different systems. So I was integrating everything and built it from the ground up. So I was introduced to the architecture aspect of things pretty early on. And I'd been doing some enterprise architecture as well prior to that. So I had an interest there. So I decided to just keep going with Salesforce, and I have a heavy background in integration. I've worked for an integration middleware company, so architecture is something I am passionate about, and carried it along all these years in the Salesforce ecosystem. So in the past few years, as everyone knows, architecture has become a big thing. And the idea behind this presentation was to help people understand what architecture actually is and what it is all about. And I'm talking more specifically on the technical architecture path, because there is a path that's a little bit more solution architecture focused. So this is more the technical architect path that's more of like the developer, senior developer type of path. So I'll get started. So as I mentioned, architecture is a huge buzzword these days in the ecosystem, especially with the introduction of the pyramid, which you can see here. So there's all these certifications that you can get now so that you can become either an application architect or a system architect. And, on the way to becoming a CTA. So that's at the top of the pyramid. And I believe Salesforce has introduced even more architect certifications now. I believe they have a certified solution architect certification as well as a couple others. So it's kind of exciting to see how they're expanding it, and they're coming out with these other architect certifications to help other people get involved and get more into the architecture space. A lot of people might wonder, is architecture something that you can do? And I believe at any level you can do architecture. Like I mentioned, I was just a senior developer and I was brought into a company and I was doing architecture. I mean, it just happened that way. It wasn't like I set out to do it. It was just the nature of what I was doing within the job. And I learned design patterns, and I learned integration patterns, and I learned service-oriented architecture. And these are things that I just studied on my own and learned on the job. And that's all part of, it's part of what an architect does, is, you figure things out and just kind of explore and use best practices and learn along the way. So why is it important? Well, architecture has become very important because, as all of you know, Salesforce is constantly acquiring other companies. And now that with the force.com platform, you can write code. And so there's a way to do things so that Salesforce is scalable and so that your performance is not hindered. So these type of things you have to keep in mind. You don't want your implementations to be too complex. You want your project to be successful. You want to get it right the first time as much as possible. I know it seems impossible these days, but you really want to put that thought up front into the architecture before you actually start doing your implementation, because you don't want to have costs down the road that you're not expecting. I've worked with so many different clients where they've brought people in that they knew Salesforce, but they didn't quite know it, and they weren't using best practices, and they were creating custom objects when they probably should have been using out of the box. Well, they should have been using out of the box for sure. And I've had to go in and I've had to unwind these orgs and redo things so that I'm using the Salesforce out of the box functionality as much as possible. Fixing code structure so that it's set up properly, so that the system's scalable and you can build upon it in the future, because everyone's investing a lot in Salesforce and they don't want to be getting rid of it. I've worked with customers who have been very frustrated with it because it wasn't implemented properly. So to go in and straighten everything out and get them running properly so that we can build cool things and they can actually see the value of Salesforce, which I think all of us want our clients or whoever we're working with to see the value of Salesforce. So that's why proper architecture and design up front is important. So this leads me to how you can start thinking more like an architect. There are different skills that architects will keep in mind in their day-to-day jobs. The first thing I want to talk about is thinking big picture. So thinking, will this scale beyond the current problem I am solving? Things like creating a lookup field versus a master detail. And what are the implications of that? If don't just create a field and say, oh, well, this lookup field will work or this master detail will work. Well, think longer term, like, okay, well, who are the users that are going to access these fields, and what are the security implications of this, things like that. Record ownership in the role hierarchy. That's another thing that an architect would think about and keep in mind when designing an org, security model, things like that. Taking in mind large data volumes. So what you decide to do can affect large data volumes. So not every company has large data volumes, but some do. And I actually work with a client right now that does have them. So things like lookup fields are affected by large data volumes. You can have something called lookup data skew, where you have more than 10,000 records pointing to one field. So that can cause issues. You can look at the types of integrations you have with your external systems. So there's a time and place for each kind of integration. It's not one is better than the other. And that's another thing I hear when working with clients. They'll say something like, well, I heard that master detail isn't as good as lookup, or vice versa. And I always have to say, well, it's not that one is better than the other. It's that one has a better use over the other. So that's why they exist. One is for one situation, another is for another. So the same that goes with integration. So using the REST API versus the SOAP API versus the bulk API, and knowing when to use each one. So if you're setting up an integration with another system, you want to think, all right, well, am I going to be sending large amounts of data? Well, you might want to think about using the bulk API. Or is it for a web-based app? Am I just sending some data one record at a time? You might want to think about REST. Or is this something where we might need some integration middleware, something like MuleSoft? Things like real-time callouts from Lightning components that can cause issues if it's not done right. So you might want to think about a different way to do those kind of integrations. Another thing is using Heroku for processing large data sets and for reporting. Heroku is an area that I've gotten into lately. I do have the Heroku certification. I actually have 24 certifications as of right now. And Heroku is a great system for moving data out of Salesforce and into somewhere else for processing and for reporting. And as I mentioned, the lookup and ownership skew. Ownership skew is when you have someone in the role hierarchy that owns more than 10,000 records. So you would want to move them to the top of the role hierarchy so that you don't end up with record locking from the sharing calculations that happen each time something changes. Another thing you can do is create diagrams. They don't have to be complex. I put a very simple diagram up here for you. You just show the data model for some new objects that need to be created for a new business process. So I know a lot of people probably just go in and they create their objects and here it is, I'm done. Well, maybe before doing that, actually sit down and create a diagram, get Visio or Lucidchart and draw out what it is you're setting up. The diagram I have here is actually representing an integration. So maybe you're doing an integration and you want to explain how this is going to work. I have an example here. It shows Facebook social sign-on with OpenID Connect, and maybe an outbound messaging using SOAP to an external system that only has a SOAP interface, things like that. If you're using platform events, you can show how that's working within a diagram. So creating diagrams is a great tool. It's a great way to document your technical debt and explain to business users how the solution is going to work and how it fits into the bigger picture. And here's an example of just, an ERD, just very, it's not too complex. You can easily create these and add your types of lookups and, one to many and, master detail. And this is what you'd want to, you want to label it with, large data volumes, and that's getting a little bit more complex, but you can keep it pretty simple. I just want to give an idea of different kinds of diagrams that you can create. Another area that architects keep in mind is best practices. So you want to follow best practices. So, if you don't know what the best practices are for Salesforce administration or development, there's a lot of resources out there to learn these things. So, things like using description fields on automations and also on your fields, especially where, maybe your field is a formula field and, it's used, or your field is used in an automation somewhere and it's important. It has an important function somewhere in the business process. You probably want to put a description there. Things like never hard coding your URLs, caching SQL queries for static data. And this is just an example list. This isn't an extensive list of best practices, but I just want to give you guys an idea of what some of the best practices are. So you can go and research this a bit further, and you can make a list of best practices that you can follow. And then if your company, or if you work for a consulting company, if your clients don't have best practices, it's always a good idea to bring them in at the beginning of an implementation or at the beginning of a project. Something that's also big for architects is relying on automation as much as possible, which is the whole clicks versus code thing. It's not always the best to just go and write code to solve a problem. Sometimes you're better off using a flow or process builder. And then if there's something that's too complex, you can always write Apex that can be used with the automations. Something else, using a trigger framework. So some people might be familiar with MPSP that has the TDTM, the trigger framework built right in. And I love that. I think all of Salesforce should be set up like that, because then our triggers would be so much cleaner. So I love the TDTM. Using things like custom metadata types in your code instead of hard coding variables, so that you can have more config instead of having to go into code and change things. And then, some other examples: lazy loading for large data sets, custom permissions to define access checks. It's just some other more developer focused things here. Next is governance. So governance is something that isn't always easily understood. And even in the architect world, it's like, well, we need governance, but what really is governance? Well, it can be as simple as having a defined deployment process, or how you use your sandboxes, defining, your setup. Like each developer has their own developer sandbox, or now with Salesforce DX, we don't have to worry about that as much because we have Scratch orgs, which is also another great feature that Salesforce has come out with lately. How you promote your code to production, what's the process it follows. These are the types of things that fall under governance that an architect would care about and would want to establish. And this is something that anyone can do. If you don't have these processes and governance in place, then it's never too late to bring it in and start establishing these standards. Things like setting up source control. Source control is also part of governance. Using CI/CD tools, there's quite a few out there, and things like Jenkins or Capado, they're great. They help with the whole deployment process. I've just seen so many nightmares with not having a solid deployment process or automated CI/CD in place, that it just causes so many issues. This is just an example, the different kinds of sandboxes and the types of storage. And one thing you want to keep in mind with your sandboxes is this refresh interval. So you don't want to be using a full sandbox for something where you have to refresh it often. So that's usually the type of environment you use for like UAT, or right before you go to production. That's your full copy of production. You make sure everything works the way it should before you promote to production. But the developer sandboxes are ones that you can refresh every day. And the partial copy, you get still only 5 days between refreshes, and a lot of places will use partial copy for QA. So those are great sandboxes for from. Hold on a second, my phone was ringing. So yeah, the different sandboxes and the different ways you use them, that can be defined, and that's part of governance as well. Another thing you can do is understand your org security model. So security is another area that's really big with architecture, just because of the implications it has on performance and things like record locking, and also who can see what data. So something like PII, which is personally identifiable information, that's a big thing, or if you've worked with Europe and the GDPR, personal information is a big thing these days. And then California has now, I think, the I forget what it's called, CCSPA, or they have, it's kind of like GDPR. So your security model is important because it defines who can see what data and who has access to what. And that's that has to be designed properly, especially when you've got a lot of data and you don't know who can see what. So, looking at things like your role hierarchy and how that might affect your your performance of your system. Do you have someone in the role hierarchy that owns a lot of records? Well, that's not good. You want to make sure that they're higher up in the hierarchy, and because when those recalculations are done, it's going to cause issues. Your sharing roles, things like that, you want to look at. Org-wide defaults, you always want to make sure those are properly set, because that will determine as well who can see what data in the privacy. Territory assignments, apex sharing, it's another area you can look at, and that has implications. Sometimes there can be some apex sharing being used and cause issues. And I mentioned the ownership of the 10,000 records and the lookups to objects that have more than 10,000 records. Those are two big things, and understanding that can really go a long way in an org that has large data volumes. Something else an architect would want to do is utilize the clouds as much as possible. So Salesforce, has many products, and they have, many different clouds, and they all have their different functions pretty much in all different areas of business. So maybe you have a project coming up and you don't have anything in house that could solve the problem. Maybe you have a new marketing initiative, and Salesforce out of the box isn't gonna work. So maybe you start looking at Marketing Cloud or Part Up, depending on the type of marketing you're doing, whether it's B2B or B2C. There's sales and service cloud that have their different features. So maybe you look at the different features that are available and solve your problem using out of the box. Like I mentioned before, the out of the box is what you want to use as much as possible. The whole clicks versus code. Bring the out of the box features to use as much as possible. So like I mentioned, sometimes people go in and they create customizations where they really shouldn't, because then that's going to affect how your org can use App Exchange apps. Or when Salesforce does upgrades, you're not going to be getting the latest and greatest features, and you're just going to be missing out on a lot of the additional functionality that comes along with each release that Salesforce puts out each year. So at one of my clients, they had someone go in there and create a custom case object, which I was just like, I don't understand why you would do that, but they did that, and we had to unwind that and get them on the out of the box case object. So then they could use things like case teams and all the cool functionality that Salesforce gives you with using cases. Another thing you could do is engage stakeholders. So usually there are business stakeholders when you're creating some piece of functionality with Salesforce. It's just because the nature of Salesforce is it's a system that supports business. So usually there's some sort of business stakeholder. So engage with those stakeholders. Speak up to volunteer to communicate with them. Help fill in any missing gaps there may be in the requirements. And communicate project objectives. So that communication with the stakeholders is a big part of architecture. And that's why things like drawing diagrams are very important, because that's a good way that you can communicate with them and show them what's being built and what's going on in a way that they can more easily understand. And be curious. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. Try to see what's really going on behind the scenes. Ask questions about the technical aspects of how a solution is implemented. If you don't know, start just poking around and asking questions. A good architect always wants to know the why and how, and the details of how everything is working behind the scenes. I mentioned in my experience when I started, I was actually given a task to fix something that was broken. We had some SQL scripts that imported data from one system and brought it into another, and they kept breaking every time the system was upgraded. I was like, well, this doesn't sound right. And I kind of knew about disparate systems from doing my graduate degree, and I suggested that we start bringing in like a service-oriented architecture and an integration middleware to alleviate these problems. So, if it's in a situation like that, if someone asks you to go break something that's constantly fixing, don't just fix it. Like maybe look at it like, okay, what's the root of the problem here? And maybe there's another way to fix it. Something like bringing in an integration middleware. You can be a hero for doing that. Poke around in your org, play around in a sandbox, testing out what happens when you make changes to things like security or sharing, or even test out integrations, or test out things. This is something I do all the time. Test out, doing SSO with Salesforce as an IDP, or or an SP, making connections with something like Heroku where you can easily set something up, or there's IDPs out there that you can play around with and see what's going on behind the scenes when you're actually setting up something like SSO. And finally, here are some architect resources. One of my favorites at the top is Ladies Be Architects. Very good friends with Gemma, who founded Ladies Be Architects. There's also the Salesforce Architect community. A few of the blogs that I know of, such as Gemma, Susanna. Susanna is also another good friend of mine. So yeah, there's some good resources out there and some good blogs. And if you want to start learning more, there's a lot out there. It's just becoming such a bigger thing these days because it is so important. And I'm happy that people are starting to realize the importance of architecture in the Salesforce ecosystem. And that's it.
Awesome. So let's see, too many questions. I have one. Since I'm off mute, I'll just go ahead and ask it. So asking for the slides. Yeah, my question is, I've seen you mention yourself as like an architect in progress or architect in process. Can you talk about like your architect journey and where you are in that?
Sure. Yep. So as I mentioned, I started getting into architecture early on in my career, and I was always doing development work as well. And then the CTA was something I was aware of, like maybe 6 years ago, and I thought, I really like to do that. That sounds something like it's really cool. I always wanted to get certified. I actually wanted to get certified in Salesforce when I was working for an integration middleware company, and then I ended up leaving there, and that didn't happen. So they didn't even have the CTA back then, but it was when they first came out with their certifications. I think this was 2008 or 2009. So then I ended up getting the Platform Developer 1 certification. And I didn't get it until 2016, which was kind of funny. I ended up just waiting and putting it off. But because I wanted to do the CTA, that was a requirement. And this is before they came out with the pyramid. So I started looking into it all and getting familiar with it all. And I wanted to do it back then. But then they came out with the pyramid, and I was like, oh, now I have to do all these other certifications. So I just kind of put it to the side because I've been trying to build my consulting company, and that's pretty time consuming. So in 2018, I needed to get another certification for my partner status. So I went and had to get the admin certification. I didn't even have that. And then I went and got Sales Cloud. So that gave me my 2 certifications for my company. And I was like, I'm just going to keep doing certification. I'm just going to get caught up. I really should have a lot more than this being in the ecosystem for so long. Because for some of us that started a long time ago, we were able to get by without really having a certification. We had the experience, but nowadays you really need the certifications with the experience. I always recommend, don't just go get the certifications. Actually put your certification to use for a bit, or get hands-on experience before you do it, especially with the architect certifications. So I just went and started doing all of them. And I did 19 certifications from May until December in 2018, which is a little crazy. So I don't recommend doing that to anybody, but if you feel like doing a bunch all at once, go ahead and do it. So I did I just kind of blew through all the designer exams, just one after the other. But I don't agree with doing that. I think you should do one and then try to actually incorporate what you've learned on the job, like hands-on, so that you really get a deep understanding. And so then, in 2018, I became eligible for the CTA. And I was just like, yeah, I got to go do this. And then I did the prep course actually so the person who hired me back in 2006 when I first started with Salesforce, he's now a CTA, and he's who taught my course, my 601 course, which was pretty cool. Steve Baines. So shout out to Steve Baines. And I realized doing that course, like, wow, I'm really not ready. Part of it was having to do the presentation, and I'm not really a big presenter. So having to put together a presentation, like for me, like this London's Calling presentation, I spent like a month just kind of chipping away at it. And I just noticed I still even had a couple mistakes on it. I wasn't even done. So I'm just not a big presentation person. So I'm still on the CTA journey. I know I have the technical knowledge. It's just a matter of being able to take that knowledge and really articulate it into a presentation. That takes practice. And so I'm still on the journey, and maybe I'll try to do it this year, but with the way things are going, it's probably going to be next year just because of the the current situation that we're in. I just don't really see that happening. But I do recommend that anyone that wants to go on the journey to give yourself time. It's been a couple years for me now, and I'm someone that has a lot of experience, and I did a lot of certifications really fast. But the CTA is not about certifications. It's about it's about your experience really, and being able to take these situations and articulate them and present them.
There's a question here for you. What common challenges and pitfalls do you face on a day-to-day basis while working on multiple projects?
So for me, working on multiple projects, especially being in consulting, is having to switch gears so often. So like right now, I'm actually a developer for a company, and I'm actually in the whole agile deployment process. So, having to use GitHub and having to create branches and having to do checkouts and, commits and pull requests and all that. And not doing that every day, it's like I've done it in the past, so I'll be doing that for a bit, and then I go off and I'm doing something else where maybe I'm just doing design, or I've had projects where I've just been writing tech specs and handing those off to developers. So having to switch gears is a little difficult. So it's like jumping into this whole deployment process again is like almost like learning all over again. It's just having to submerge myself in that is it's interesting because I am an architect for them as well, but I am helping to do development work. So sometimes I am put in these roles where I'm doing both architecture and development. So having to switch gears and go from one to the other is not always the easiest thing. But some of the pitfalls I run into just like in what the position I'm doing now with one of my clients is having to take into consideration all the best practices of coding. So you're not doing it every day. Sometimes you forget some of the things, or things change a bit, so you might be doing something an old way, and they're like, oh no, this is the new way to do it, this is the new. So kind of having to stay on top of that is also a little challenging.
We've got two more questions for you. I'm going to go out of order. So one was about why you started your company and what was the motivation for you?
Sure. So I decided to start my company because I've never been a very good employee. just to be blunt about it, I really have not ever been a very good employee. And I think it's because I want to do things my way, and I just don't like having to answer to bosses. But it's interesting because having a consulting company, I have clients that I have to answer to. So it's a little bit different. There's a little bit more control over my schedule and things like that. And I like having flexibility, but you still have to answer to people. So it's just in a different capacity. Some people love being a contributor on a team, and that's their thing. Like me, I work well on teams, but I just kind of like doing my own thing, I guess. That's the motivation behind it. And also I did want to build a company that was very architecture focused. So that is another reason why I did it. I didn't want to just build any old consulting company, but I wanted it very architecture focused and to have architecture in mind. So we have architecture oversight from the beginning to end on all projects, not just at the beginning, or there's, even if it's just like a couple hours a week or something, there's just always an architect available overseeing the projects. So that's another motivation for me.
Another question is, how would you go about building a scalable system versus budgeting issues with time it takes to build one? So basically doing the right thing versus how much time you have estimated. What does that look like for you?
So, yep, that's a good question. So what you want to look at is, what are the must-haves? You don't want to build, everything out of the gate. And, if you have to take into consideration budget and timeline, well, then you have to reduce your scope and then maybe even take a phased approach. So that's what I always do. When I have clients that start asking for everything, I'm like, all right, what is it you actually really need? And what can you push off to another phase when you get more funding and have a bigger budget? So that's usually how I approach that. And then what we do keep in scope that, take in mind things like, it's going to cost X amount of dollars to write all this in code, whereas it might be $10 a month to go find an app on the App Exchange. I didn't really talk about the App Exchange too much, but App Exchange is a great resource for architects in knowing what's out there in the App Exchange, and what problems apps might be able to solve is another big area of architecture.
What are some of the common design mistakes that you've had to untangle as an architect?
definitely the writing custom objects when they're not, they really should be custom. Another one that I had to do was not have the account model. That's actually, I probably should put that in my presentation because account model is a big one. Whether you're using person accounts, that's another thing is you hear, oh, person accounts are horrible. Well, really, they do have a use. In fact, in the CTA world, person accounts come up a lot and they do have a purpose and a use. So it's not just, oh, always stay away from person accounts, but person accounts, you don't want to use them with MPSP, or you don't want to use them for certain kinds of account models. So really nailing the account model front is important. That's one that, if you mess that up at the beginning, that's a lot of untangling and expensive to untangle. Then you have all your data migration and everything. It's just, it creates a big mess. So those are a couple of the big ones: the creating custom objects and creating custom functionality when it already exists in Salesforce, and the account model.
And some of the industry specific clouds really kind of drive you to those types of personal accounts or individual accounts as well.
Yeah, those definitely have an impact as well. Yep.
Any favorite tools?
Yeah, I use, like for charting, I use Lucid Charts. I use Postman for testing APIs and things like that. Like, I worked on a project where we had to integrate with MuleSoft endpoints and using Postman to test the endpoints and get back the responses so that we could see the JSON response that we had to parse. Let's see what else. I use IntelliJ for my development environment. I use VS Code as well. I've got both. It always depends. It depends on the environment. And some places are like, oh, we want you using VS Code. Some places are like, oh, you use IntelliJ. I do really like the plugins in IntelliJ, but VS Code works well with Salesforce DX. So it depends. What else? Those are the biggest ones I can think of.
Someone asked, was there any reason for sharing invisibility over any of the other architect exams? Why you did that one first?
The sharing of visibility?
Yeah.
Doing that one first. I think it sets a good foundation for the rest of them, because the concepts of that one do show up in some of the other ones, especially the data architect. And I think it's a bit of in the integration. They all kind of overlap, but there is a good progression of how they should be done. And sharing invisibility is probably the best one to start with. And it is tough. It's not the easiest, but if you can get past that one, it's going to make the other ones a tiny bit easier.
What technologies do you think a Salesforce architect should know, or at least have some idea of outside of the Salesforce platform to be a good architect?
Definitely like security, SSO, which is single sign-on. Things like Active Directory, or identity providers, things like Okta, and how those can be used with Salesforce, and the security behind those, which is the SAML assertions. So understanding the SAML and the communication. So SSO is a big thing that is brought into Salesforce architecture that's not specifically Salesforce, but there's things you do in Salesforce to enable it for that. Let's see, reporting systems, BI systems, understanding what those are good for, because one of the things with architecture is once you start having too much data in Salesforce, you actually want to start moving it off platform. Salesforce is not a good data warehouse. It's not meant to be a data warehouse. It should only have enough data to support your business functions. And then once data is older, you want to archive it off platform, because that has a big implication for performance and data integrity and all that. So you really want to understand the different types of ways you can archive your data and still access it if required. So it's another one. and integration tools, integration middleware, because not everyone's going to be able to use MuleSoft. So having a good idea of what's out there, low cost integration tools, mid-level integration tools, things that, there's some out there that are free that can do some simple integrations, like there's Zapier and stuff like that. Jitterbit's another lower cost integration middleware, and then MuleSoft is going to be up there at the top because it's not cheap, but it is, for in an enterprise environment, it is a really good choice.
Outside of 601 class, have you done any additional mock review boards?
Yes, I have, and they're actually on. Well, I haven't presented yet. I've been part of them, I should say. So, and I haven't presented just because I'm not, like I said, I'm not a presenter, and I don't want to present until I feel like I really can present. But if you can see behind me, I have my Flipboard up there ready to go for when I want to start presenting on camera to do mock review boards. But I helped out last year someone preparing for their review board, and I actually was a judge, and I had to fire questions at him, at the end of his presentation and poke all the holes in it. And so that was actually kind of fun, and it helped me because I was reading the scenarios and I was solutioning them myself before he presented, and then he would present. And so that way I knew what questions to ask, because if he came up with something that I thought was totally wrong and I had it a different way, I would ask him questions about it. So it was actually really a good practice to prepare myself for reading through scenarios and understanding how to solution them. I actually helped Java as well when preparing for her review board. So yeah, I've been involved, but I haven't presented myself yet, and that's something I'm going to need to do in the not so distant future.
We don't have any other questions listed. Anybody else have questions? Go ahead and jot them down. Anything you want to share with us in terms of new features, things on the horizon that you're really kind of tracking and find interesting?
I would say one of the things that this actually came up in a discussion the other day, which everyone's probably heard about, is platform events. That's really, my background is integration, so I'm really excited about platform events and using that for real-time integrations. And I've actually seen someone ask me, are they scalable? I'm like, oh, it's funny. I actually specifically went to a presentation at Dreamforce in the Architect Theater about the fact that they can handle a lot and they are very scalable. So I'm excited about that. So platform events, I'd like to see being used a lot more for integration. And I actually was working with the streaming API and Comet D, the platform events is all based on that push notifications. I actually wrote, I didn't mention this, I actually wrote software in 2015 that was acquired by Salesforce, and now it's known as Salesforce Messaging. So that was something I wrote for a company. They brought me in, they didn't have any Salesforce expertise, and they're like, can you build this? I was like, sure, this looks like a lot of fun. And actually, I was like, this is going to be something big that, probably will get acquired. So, and I was right. A couple of years later, Salesforce bought them up.
Great. What kind of architecture problems or challenges do you usually face with Lightning Web Components, or just with Lightning experience?
I haven't worked with the Lightning Web Components too much yet. I know like a lot of places have been hesitant to adopt them because they still have a lot of limitations. But Lightning in general, your event, how your events are bubbled up, that usually can cause issues. Something I mentioned in the presentation is any type of like call outs from Lightning components can cause issues for integration. So if you have a user working in the UI and they click a button and then it makes a call out to another system, and then that's a there's also something I didn't mention is synchronous versus asynchronous. I try to keep it high level, but knowing asynchronous versus synchronous, I probably want to add that to my presentation as well. Understanding the difference between those and how they can affect your performance. So maybe you're making a synchronous call out, real-time call out from a web component. That's going to cause issues. Like if it takes 5 minutes, the user's going to be stuck and they're going to be locked up. So trying to think what else with Lightning. that I've encountered. Can't really think right now.
Anything with Aura?
Yeah, with Aura. But yeah, I haven't worked with the Lightning Web Components too much now, because there are the limitations, like I think one of them is you can't call process builders from Lightning Web Components. So you have to use an Aura container, things like that. So having to use Aura containers to work around some of the issues. But it's a good way to start moving off of Aura components. So when Lightning did come out, it had a lot of limitations, but I did actually recommend it. I was working with a client that wanted to build a community and they wanted to do it in Visualforce. And this is when Lightning was already out. I was like, that would be ridiculous. Don't spend all this time and money building a whole brand new community in Visualforce. Do it in Lightning and then deal with what doesn't work by doing workarounds, because they're going to address it somewhere down the road. So that's actually a good example of trying to think big picture. Like, okay, where's Salesforce going? They're going to Lightning. Well, don't spend all this time in Visualforce, because that's just going to cost them money down the road to rewrite that in Lightning. So I got them to develop it off the bat in Lightning, and you can still do things like write Visualforce pages and surface them in Lightning. There's a way to work around some of the issues. So I've done that with some clients where not everything works in Lightning communities. So you've got to come up with some workarounds. Usually there's a way to do it. So.
Great. So someone asked, Heroku versus MuleSoft, which do you prefer? And I guess they want to know which they should learn first, but I think that's personal preference.
So they're actually kind of different. So MuleSoft is an integration platform. And so to explain MuleSoft, you can do data loading, like bringing data from one system into Salesforce with MuleSoft, but it's not intended just for that, but you can do it. It's intended to be an enterprise service bus. So you have multiple systems being connected through MuleSoft to Salesforce, and Salesforce connecting to multiple systems through MuleSoft. So something that you could use with MuleSoft is called change data capture with platform events. So whenever data changes in Salesforce, you can have that data sent to MuleSoft, and then whatever systems care about that data will receive that data and they will get updated. So it's a way for systems to subscribe to changes that they care about from other systems. Heroku is a whole nother development platform, similar to Salesforce, but it's a platform as a service, whereas Salesforce is software as a service. So the Salesforce software is already written for you, and then you customize it and configure it. With Heroku, it's a platform as a service. So it offers more flexibility, and you can actually develop apps on it. You can develop web apps, and you can develop in I think 8 or 9 different languages like Java, Python, Ruby. You're not confined to just the one language like we have Apex for Salesforce. So it's pretty cool. So if you want to create a web app that's not Salesforce specific, you can write one on Heroku, and then you can have that app integrate with Salesforce very easily. And Heroku does actually have, they do have integration as well, but not like integration middleware. They just have ways to do the same type of thing that MuleSoft does for like sending messages around and communicating with other apps. But it's different because it is the platform as a service, so it is more flexible. And so I guess if you're more geared towards writing web apps, it might be good to explore Heroku. If you're more geared towards systems integration, you'd want to go towards MuleSoft.
Great. Somebody had asked about, they're studying for the integration architect designer certification, and they're saying that it's hard to get hands-on with integration experience. Do you have any ways they can do that?
Yeah, it is hard. That's a bummer. So one of the things I mentioned is you can play around with integrating Salesforce and Heroku. So you can spin up a free Heroku hobby account, and you can set up some integrations there. Something else I do is, I don't remember if this is on the integration exam, but the identity and access management exam, definitely play around with identity providers. There's ones out there that give you 30-day free trials. You can also do IDP with Salesforce and Heroku as well, but yeah, it's hard. You know, maybe like free databases out there, anything that has an API that you can connect with for free, that's a good place to start. Google, I think, you know, Twitter, things like that. I've actually, today I was researching, so I do stuff in the stock market as well. And I'm part of a group, and I was like, we really should create a scanner for Twitter. And I was like, we need to write this on Heroku. And I went and I pulled up a blog about how to scan Twitter for trending topics on Heroku, which is pretty cool. So, you know, write a web app on Heroku and connect it to Twitter. You can do that from Salesforce as well. So yeah, I would say look for any free APIs and see how you can connect from Salesforce. So you want to look at connecting using platform events. You want to look at connecting using Apex. You know, there's also some tools out there. I think there's a free trial version of Jitterbit as well. So if you want to practice playing around with those kind of integrations, even using something like Postman to hit an API endpoint and then see the response that's coming back, you can really understand what's going on there. You can see the data that's being returned. You can see the headers and things like that. And that also helps for OAuth as well. You can start to understand OAuth, which is that's getting a little bit deeper in. But OAuth is involved in integration and connected apps, and it's also part of security as well. So that's one of those things that is both part of integration and identity access management.
Any more questions? Go ahead and put them in the chat. I don't see anything else. Any more? Okay, that was great. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Melissa.
Yep.
Thanks.
Well done.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks, you too.
You too.
Buddy.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.